In 1990, Fire Emblem released its first game, with Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. This was the start of a series which at the time of recording this spanned 17 main series entries, 35 years, and 10 different continents. These continents are the breeding ground for world building, and Archenea is the first continent in Fire Emblem history. It is also the continent with the most games on it, because excluding Awakening, which is categorized under the continent's new name of Ylisse, the first Fire Emblem game got a spin-off called Fire Emblem BS, and then a sequel in 1994, which expanded on the story of the first game and created an entirely new story called The War of Heroes. The first game would be remade in 2008 and The War of Heroes in 2010. However, despite all this attention, Archenea was still the first continent to be created, meaning the remakes are based off of a foundation which is a bit old, and Fire Emblem has had a lot of time to improve its world building. So, how well does this continent hold up compared to every one that came after? Well, that is a bit of a complicated question, as the most important aspect of world building is detail, and how much detail was put into the continent depends on what aspect of world building you want to talk about, as the detail ranges from quite a bit to not nearly enough. Still, there are definitely some admirable qualities about the way in which Archenea exceeds at world building, so let us start with some interesting details about the history of the dragons, the foundation of Archenea, and the legend of Henri. Part 1. The history of the Archenean continent. In the beginning, the dragons ruled over the world, and humanity experienced a golden age in the city of Thebes, living alongside and learning from these dragons, who were led by Naga, ruler of the Divine Dragon Clan. Below the Divine Dragon Clan were the Ice Dragons, Mage Dragons, Fire Dragons, and most powerfully of all, the Earth Dragons. For a while, peace reigned in Thebes, but eventually humanity's hubris overtook the city and it was destroyed, leaving nothing but ruins, as even the memory of this once prosperous city seemed to fade away over time. The story of Thebes is an interesting one, but I definitely feel it could have been better fleshed out in Archenea. Now, I do believe the story of Thebes should still be covered in a misty haze, but the problem is with how forgettable Thebes is in terms of its effect on the world building, as most of the information about Thebes comes from echoes, for I think the legacy of Thebes should permeate through Archenea as kind of a melancholic idea of how everyone could have so easily worked together to create a better society, dragon and human alike, yet that did not happen. Still, at a certain point, all hope of a new golden age was lost, as the dragons started to degenerate, with their birth rates declining and their madness setting in. Thus, to stop the degeneration, Naga urged the dragons to become Manichees and to seal their dragon powers inside stones in order to take on human form. But many dragons were too proud and refused to do so, most noticeably the powerful Earth Dragon clan, with all but Medius, their prince, degenerating. Eventually, Naga had no choice but to go to war against these degenerated dragons who had begun to attack humans and seal them with the Binding Shield, which would one day become to be known as the Fire Emblem. A while after the battle, Naga began to die, so as their final act, Naga made a sword out of one of their own fangs, which was named the Falchion, and placed it inside the fane of Ramon. Naga then sealed their daughter Tiki away, recognizing her power as too great and knowing that if this power were used improperly, it could harm the entire world. I feel Naga is a pretty interesting character in terms of Fire Emblem world building, being halfway between mortal and god, with them even being named after the half-human, half-snake deities from Hinduism. This plays into how Naga always manages to have an air of authority and a presence over the continent that adds nicely to the world building. For Naga is responsible for setting in motion a lot of the events in the main story, including making the falchion and the Fire Emblem shield, which are probably the most iconic items in the whole series. Honestly, Naga has the impact that I wish Thebes did, as we know just enough about their history for it to be impactful, but still lack quite a bit of information, so Naga still remains mysterious. However, I feel at times this mysterious nature can lead to confusion, including over what Naga's gender was originally meant to be, which is the reason I have been using terms like they and them. Another issue is that certain additions have made Naga feel less mysterious and powerful, as seen in the FE12 remake. For this game heavily implies that after Naga passed away, they were reincarnated into Nagi, who resided in the alternate dimension of the Alter Sphere, where she is in a deep sleep until awakened to fight again, though in this reincarnation it is stated she is much weaker than the original version, even giving the hero another falchion, which makes the blade feel less special, though this one is also stated to be much weaker than the original. Yet not all additions to a game are bad, because FE1 in many ways is pretty basic in its world building, and the history is not much more advanced than the dragons were attacking us, and we have the sword and a shield to fight them. However, FE3 seems to be the first Fire Emblem game that really tried hard with its storytelling and world building, with a good example of this being the chapters dedicated to fighting degenerated dragons, which are full of world building information. In fact, dragon degeneration is a concept which FE3 came up with, and it is a concept I quite like, as this idea adds to some interesting world building and characterization for the dragons. Still, this is far from the only thing that FE3 adds, as the story of Ardra is also new, and it says that after Naga sealed the Earth Dragons, Medius was assigned to guard the Fire Emblem. But eventually a thief named Ardra came in and stole the shield. He sold the gems on the shield and became rich, buying 3 legendary weapons and consolidating a bunch of city-states into the continent's first kingdom, which was named Archenea. For a long time, there was stability, but over the years, Medius grew angry over the theft and by the fact that humans kept attacking Manichetes, so Medius turned against the humans, created the Kingdom of Dolor, and waged war against humanity, nearly wiping them all out. I think this is an interesting backstory, and it could have made Medius into a really compelling villain, but my problem is with how little influence the backstory actually has, for Medius barely has any dialogue, and most of the dialogue he does have just boils down to, "I will kill the humans, mwahaha." There is honestly only one thing Medius says that even hints at his interesting motivations, as after his final defeat, he talks about the greed of humanity. To be blunt, I think the only reason this backstory was written is in an unconvincing attempt to make Medius seem more nuanced than he was in the original FE1. I also think this backstory was made to call into question the divine right to rule of the kingdom of Archenea, as it was not founded by someone noble but by a thief. However, this history has no real effect on the story, as Marf is the main character and is from Altea, so he does not have to deal with the consequences of learning his family was founded by a man who lacked nobility in more ways than one, nor does he ever have to question why someone deserves to rule a kingdom. Honestly, I think one of the biggest issues Marf has as a protagonist in FE3 is how disconnected from the story he feels, and this is a big example as to why. For the world building and story should seamlessly blend together, but here these ideas regarding the backstory of Medius and Audra lack cohesion, so they feel unsatisfying and unresolved. Still, there is more to the tale of the Fire Emblem than this, for while Medius did manage to wipe out most of the Archenean royal family, one princess named Artemis did manage to survive and hide for years, until eventually Artemis meets the hero Henri, who traveled across the desert for her and retrieved the falchion, which he used to slay Medius. This story is a pretty obvious parallel to the tale of Nina and Marf, because Nina is the descendant of Artemis and the last princess of Archenea, as all the royals were killed after Medius laid waste to Archenea again, while Marf is the person who slayed Medius and is related to Henri. The main difference is that Nina and Marf have a purely platonic relationship. By contrast, the Princess Artemis was in love with Henri, but they could not be together due to him not being a noble, so Artemis cursed the Fire Emblem, calling it the death of war and of love. Thus, Artemis eventually decided to marry Cartes, who she had entrusted the Fire Emblem to, but who Artemis never loved, with her dying in childbirth. Nina also applies this curse to herself and says she was destined to lose Camus due to her giving Marf the Fire Emblem, and if Marf's love interest Sheeta dies, Nina says the curse of love applies to them both. The differences between the romantic relationships of the two tales can make the parallels confusing, as logically Camus is supposed to represent Henri, but Henri is also supposed to represent Marf. Still, I like this story well enough from a story and world-building perspective, as it provides a good sense of legacy, with Nina and Marf embodying their relatives, as Nina trusts Marf and Marf slays Medius, though I wish the founders of the other countries were talked about more. Like, maybe they were 3 war heroes who used Archenea's legendary weapons, with Cartus's brother wielding the bow Parthia and founding Aurelius, one of Henri's brothers wielding the lance Gradivus and founding Grus, while the slave Iote wielded the Mercurius and founded Macedon. For I honestly think assigning one of the regalia to each nation instead of all of them belonging to Archenea would help each individual nation stand out more and tie the nations together in a more satisfying way. I also have an issue with how the information about how each country was founded is presented, because outside of Iote founding Macedon, I had to look up who created what country, and adding just a bit more detail could help. For example, the game could add some dialogue explaining the reason that Aurelius and Archenea are so close is because their first king was the brother to King Cartus of Archenea, or maybe Hardin, the descendant of Aurelius's first king, could start with a lance named after the country's founder, for these histories need more details to them, as their history is in stark contrast to the country of Archenea, which has so much detail put into it. And for all my gripes with certain plot points, this is an incredible strength, as detail tends to be the most important part of world building, as it makes the world feel like a richer place. But Aurelius, Grust, and Macedon lack this richness. However, these countries are not the only ones to exist on this continent, as outside of the country of Archenea exists Caledon, which was founded by Goto and has one of the richest histories and quite a complicated present. Part 2. Goto, Caledon, and the despair caused by Garneth. The wise sage Goto commands great respect and is a divine dragon. Now Goto, along with Zane being divine dragons, was likely a retcon made in FE3, because neither seems to be divine dragons in FE1, and it feels kind of out of left field. Now, I do like Zane as a divine dragon, because this change explains his power of shapeshifting, and his indifference towards humans not named Marv makes him a more interesting character, while showing one of the many ways a dragon can feel about and interact with humanity. On the other hand, I am not particularly fond of Goto as a divine dragon, because I find this makes his accomplishments less interesting, and I prefer Goto as a man who is able to do great things with his magical abilities, and not as a divine dragon who does what you would expect such a powerful being to do. For Goto was entrusted with safeguarding the world in Naga's absence, and was the one who founded Caledon, a society centered around a school of magic, which is located in a desert oasis. In this magical oasis, Goto had 2 students who stood out amongst the rest, those being Milo and Garneth. However, seeing evil in Garneth's heart, Goto gave his precious ore tome to Milo and gave him the leadership of Caledon. So in revenge, Garneth killed Milo, overtook Caledon in a coup, and decided to summon the dragon Medius. This put Goto in a bit of a precarious position, and for a while he remained distant from humanity. Now, I like this backstory, as it adds to the history of Archenea, which is already quite deep, and often has this nice vibe that feels halfway between a fairy tale and reality. Also, despite my gripes with Goto being a divine dragon, I do like the way he tends to get the ball rolling, as he is often the catalyst for the hero's victory, for eventually Goto determines he cannot sit on the sidelines and let humanity suffer. So Goto decided he needed 2 of the 5 orbs, as the light sphere, dark sphere, life sphere, geosphere, and star sphere, which have all been moved across the continent since the time Audra stole them, can be used to make powerful magic spells. For Garneth had used the dark sphere to make his signature spell, Imulo, which made him invincible, but it could be overcome by a spell Goto made from the star and light sphere, which was thus uncreatively named the Starlight Tome. Unfortunately, the life and geosphere are pretty irrelevant to the story, so the game should have either found a use for these spheres or eliminated them from the game, because I do like how those 3 spheres are fleshed out, and it really enhances the Fire Emblem, which the series is named after. Thus, the spell is used to defeat Caledon and put an end to Garneth's rule. Now, Caledon, in my opinion, is the one nation that feels really different, as the desert nation contrasts the overwhelmingly green grasslands and the country is ruled by pontifexes, contrasting the typical kings in other countries. There is also another aspect of Caledon which I need to bring up, and that is the Arabic coding, as Caledon is a desert oasis with pretty stereotypical Arabic architecture in the remake. Unfortunately, this can become an issue when you consider Caledon is a bad guy nation, with Garneth being the gray-skinned man who serves as a primary antagonist and who wants to summon with his dark magic an evil dragon. I also think what makes things even worse is how Fire Emblem Awakening handles Caledon's desert descendant in Plegia, with Valdor being another evil gray-skinned man who has more stereotypical Arabic features, with most of the important Plegians being dark magic users and more morally dubious than their non-Plegian counterparts, even if they can be nuanced characters. However, I also want to acknowledge that problematic content tends to exist on a spectrum going anywhere from slightly to extremely problematic. For there is a reason I went into Awakening's issues in such detail, and that is because I do not believe all problematic content is created equal, and there are a lot of things that keeps Caledon from being so much worse, namely the fact that there are plenty of people who do not support Garneth from Caledon and who are written as unambiguously good, like Wendell, Mello, and Linde. There is also the fact that Caledon is aligned with many other nations in FE1 who are not Arabic coded, and Garneth does not even have control over Caledon in the new story which FE3 provides. So sure, Garneth is still a bad guy, but the nation of Caledon is not, and Garneth only came to power due to a coup against the more righteous leaders. Then, as for Garneth being a gray-skinned bad guy who contrasts his whiter counterparts, while it is uncomfortable, it can pretty easily be explained by the fact that these tropes are baked into the fantasy genre and are perpetuated by writers not thinking about how easily they are to interpret as racist. I mean, Garneth himself looks rather similar to an orc, and yet I think this excuse may be a bit too generous for the Archenea saga, because this gray-skinned man was not made by Kaga, but instead by the same team who would go on to create Faladar just a few short years later. Now, this does not excuse Kaga, who has said some pretty yikes things regarding the Persians, or the original FE3 design for Garneth, which comes across as anti-Semitic, especially when you consider there are other examples of anti-Semitic caricatures in FE3, including this one who is a slave trader. Listen, having to deal with problematic material is not exactly fun, but it needs to be called out, lest it be allowed to continue to exist, and I do not think ignoring these issues for our own enjoyment is the right thing to do, so that is why I bring it up. Unfortunately, I am going to continue talking about some more not fun topics, as this anti-Semitic slave trader brings up another question, which is, what is the role of slavery in Archenea? Is slavery just something that the bad guys introduced, or did slavery exist during peacetime as well? I mean, Sheeta did once save Ogma from being punished because he helped a fellow gladiator escape. All examples of slavery have also occurred in the Canada marketplace, so maybe slavery only exists in certain countries, but it is hard to tell due to how rarely slavery is brought up and due to how vague the information is. Frankly, I think the only reason slavery is brought up is to make the heroes look good and the villains come across as more obviously evil. This means not much thought was put into the question of how something like slavery, which unfortunately is a fundamentally important aspect to the society it exists in, would affect a society. Yet you can definitely show the cruelty of the villains in a way which adds to the world building. For example, when the audience is shown the cities in ruins and the people in despair, this can really add to the desperate state of the world. This is why I think adding houses was a great idea, as it allows the audience to view how the war affects the average person. Unfortunately, there is not really a lot of incentive to visit these houses, as they do not offer any rewards, and most of the dialogue is admittedly pretty bland, often being barely disguised gameplay device. However, there are a few standout lines, including, "I hate war. It always makes women and children weep. You must continue like this. Head back to your lover's side immediately." I wish there was more of this in the original games, as dialogue like this does a good job getting us to empathize with the populace, and the remakes seemed to have agreed, as they did a good job expanding on the suffering of the populace. For a lot of the guided maps added in Fire Emblem 11 focus on the populace, as they tend to involve the new character the group is planning to recruit, trying to save some villagers. The dialogue in these paralogs is often really good, so it allows you to understand the suffering this war has put these villagers through, and the kindness of the person you are trying to recruit, who tends to be a common person that was just thrust into this war. Then in Fire Emblem 12, there is significantly more focus put on the experiences of the soldiers in Marth's army, as the new character Chris is a knight, and their prologue revolves around what it is like being a member of a platoon of knights, and honestly showing what soldiers do on a regular basis is often just as important to world building as explaining some deep lore, as it makes the world feel more lived in. For Chris's main contribution to the world building is not being Marth's super special BFF, who Archenea could not have won the war without, like the game wants you to believe, but instead it is due to the sheer amount of supports they have with the other members of Marth's army. These supports range from showing what it is like being a soldier who must sacrifice everything for their kingdom and the war effort, like is shown with Frey, to reiterating and elaborating on information we already knew, like when Chris talks to Wendell about the history of Kaladin, to exploring some friction between the noble houses of Archenea, like in his George support. There is also the fact that Chris's story in FE 12 is connected to the assassin group that Garneth has control over, so this story allows us to see into the minds of some of Garneth's most loyal minions. This creates an interesting comparison to what is going on in the main story, as Hardin and the Wolf Guard have become enemies who are being puppeted by Garneth. However, I think Chris actually handles this storyline of betrayal better, because they have a personal relationship with the assassin Katarina, so her betrayal hits harder, while Marth barely interacts with Hardin. I also personally like Katarina's arc more than the story about Hardin being corrupted by Fire Emblem's Dark Sphere, as I find seeing Katarina go from this loyal minion to someone who feels guilty about betraying Chris to someone who joins up to fight against Garnet to be more interesting. Honestly, I find there are other smaller moments in FE3 that make me empathize with the enemy far more than knowing that the Wolfguard defected, like when Yodel questions Alarian's orders for the Kaladin army to attack Altea, or when the people of Gra decide to fight for their Princess Shima, despite the likelihood of them losing. Yet I wish there were more instances where we look into the minds of the enemy and why they fought for someone as evil as Garnet, for it is these soldiers, these citizens, that speak volumes about the countries they are a part of, with these people in many ways being more important than their leaders. Part 3. Countries. Archenea is a continent at war with itself, as the 5 kingdoms of Dolour, Kaladin, Macedon, Grost, and Gra defeat Altea and the incompetently managed country of Archenea, with only Talus and parts of Auralis remaining. Oh, and Parfy is there too, I guess. Yeah, that is my first major issue with the countries, namely there are too many of them. There are 10 different countries when realistically a Fire Emblem game can only develop 5 or 6. However, I'm going to keep 8 countries because I can only really justify cutting 2. First off, Piarthi is the most obvious cut, as this country is so irrelevant that its only map was completely excluded from FE3, and you probably did not even notice or care, for the only thing interesting about Piarthi is that the country is ruled by a Manakete who does not even have a connection to Medius because the country is isolationist. The next cut is a bit harder, but I choose Gra, because outside of Piarthi, it is the country with the characters who are the least relevant to the plot, as the way these important characters are distributed means I could not justify cutting another country. For Talus has Sheeta, Macedon has Michaelis and Minerva, Kaladin has Garneth, Dolour has Medius, Grost has Camus, and Auralis has Hardin. Altea has Marth, and Archenea has Nina. I also think the story and world building would be stronger if Grost and Gra were combined, with Grost taking over Gra's main job in the story, which is to betray Altea and bring about its downfall. For these 2 countries were always close because Gra split off from Altea, so both came from the same family, which is a level of friendliness that is not exactly realistic when a ruling family splits into 2 separate countries. But I do like this theme. So maybe to justify this theme in a slightly more realistic way, Grost could have been founded by another brother of Henri to explain why they had such a close bond. This also means Camus will be partly responsible for the death of Mar's father, which makes the fighting of him more impactful. Camus is also a more memorable and physically stronger antagonist than King Joel, which makes the country that defeated Altea come across as more competent, as Gra is easily the weakest country in Medius/Garneth's alliance. The only issue left is how Shima, the Princess of Gra, factors into this. I mean, Shima is not super important, so she could be cut, but I'm not about to eliminate the one woman who is treated with dignity in FE3. So I will just say that Shima is now the king of Grust's illegitimate child, and the people want her to lead because they think the king of Grust's real children died when they were being held hostage by Medius and Garneth. This brings me to the topic of the characters who represent each nation, for if they feel important to this story, so too do their countries. For while I feel Shima does a good job with this introduction, it occurs pretty late into the story, and she is not given anything else to do, so you can only feel Gra's presence in this one late game chapter, which is pretty irrelevant to the story. So how do the other characters handle this subject? Well, I think in FE1, most of the arcs and the way the characters present their countries are pretty good, as Marth leads the Alliance to defeat Medius, and his desire to retake his home country after spending years of hiding in Talis makes Archenea feel very relevant because it serves as Marth's primary goal. Along the way, Marth also allies with many royals who are from other kingdoms who desire to destroy Medius, most notably Nina of Archenea, Hardin of Aurelis, Sheeta of Talis, and Minerva of Macedon, with each of these characters outside of Hardin having just enough relevance to the story and flesh out the world. For Nina has her conflict with Camus, who saved her but also helped overtake Archenea. Sheeta is able to recruit many characters, including a former ally who helped unite all the clans on Talis, and Minerva has her conflict with her brother Michaelis, who deposed his father the king to force Macedon to ally itself with Dolor. Unfortunately, Marth's female allies from FE1 get pretty decimated due to FE3's misogynistic writing, as Nina is a damsel who gets rescued from being sacrificed to revive Medius. Sheeta recruits less people than her subordinate Ogma, and Minerva is captured only to be rescued from her own rebellious subjects by her once evil brother Michaelis. The important female characters are thus replaced by Michaelis of Macedon and Camus of Grust, as both are reformed villains who are now fighting against Medius, but these characters undermine impactful moments from FE1 and rely on misogyny to function because they are now the saviors of Nina and Minerva, who are now weak, so that the arcs of these male characters can progress. Meanwhile, Marth just feels so out of place in the story, as Archenea being recaptured feels like a retread of what happens in FE1, especially as Elise has again been captured while trying to save Archenea. Archenea also feels less relevant because more focus is put on why Hardin would betray his BFF Marth than on reclaiming Archenea. Then the Grust royals are introduced at the start and are basically ferried around for a couple of chapters until the Grust arc is over, with them joining Marth's army and soon fading into the background. Finally, the last royal introduced is the King of Aurelis, who comes in and urges Marth to unite the world into one nation. Now, to some degree, there is setup and payoff here, even if this idea was introduced at the end of the game and barely elaborated on. Still, I think this is a bad idea because the world building in so many ways contradicts the conclusion that Archenea should be united under Marth. For example, the fact this entire world was caused by Hardin taking over Archenea and abusing his power to control the other countries as they are his suzerains. Honestly, the ending should have either been that the countries needed to drift further apart, or that Hardin usurped Nina's power and she should be put in control of all of Archenea. Yet neither of these ideas involve literally every other ruler abdicating their throne just because Marv is such a swell guy. Yeah, I really hate this conclusion. Yet there is another problem with these countries, which is how they fit on a map, as these nations are so tightly packed together when there is so much more room on the map. And while I know this was done to make these unoccupied lands feel distant, I think this feeling is not worth how cramped and confusing the map feels. So here's how I would rearrange things. I think the unoccupied lands in the northeast should belong to Dollar, which makes the country feel massive and far away. Then on an island to the south is Macedon, which is smaller than before, as it no longer is on the same island as Dollar, with Macedon being rich in minerals. To explain why, it is a former slave colony. Archenea's location stays relatively the same, occupying the southeast peninsula, while Grust still includes a couple of islands to the southwest. Caledon, on the other hand, is moved farther north, occupying the once vacant northwest peninsula, while Altea now takes Caledon's place. Then Orleans has been shifted slightly westward, encroaching on former Altean territory and making Gra a part of the nation. Also, a change I will make due to the geography is that the only part of Aurelius not conquered at the start of FE1 are these southern islands, which is where the government escaped to. Unfortunately, these nations are in many ways underdeveloped because of how having too many nations means realistically there can only be between 2 and 4 chapters for a country. These few chapters are also not used well, as the locations are very interchangeable to the point it can sometimes be confusing what country you are in, as the environment overwhelmingly consists of similar looking green grasslands and generic gray forts or palaces. Then FE3 wastes its chance to expand on these nations, as the narrative mostly has the player retaking the same capitals, so you see a lot of the same locations, and many of the new places involve dragons from the unclaimed lands, which are cool locations with interesting lore. But the story already has countries that need more development, meaning a story with a tighter structure could lead to more environmental diversity in these countries. However, even inside the current structure, there are ways to help differentiate a country's environment, as part of what makes Caledon stand out is its sandy yellow desert. So let's expand this idea out to other countries. For example, Peles, the capital of the country of Archenea, is called the City of Marble. So why not have that blend into the rest of the country by having marble pillars stick out of the ground? Aurelius is named after gold, so have that country work gold into their architecture and environment. Macedon can be based around black volcanic rocks, which are rich in minerals. Dolor can be a reddish brown to tie it into the earth dragon who rules the country. Talus can be blue, like the ocean it is surrounded by. Grust can be a sea green, showing they are also an island, which contrasts to Altea's dark green that represents the grassland and shows how the two are sibling nations. Then there is the matter of how to differentiate each nation culturally, and before I talk about how to do this, let me start by praising certain aspects of Archenea's culture. For the Archenea saga takes a lot of inspiration from antiquity, most notably with how Artemis and Mars have names referring back to Greek or Roman gods, while Macedon is named after the home of Alexander the Great, and Aurelius is based off the Latin word for gold. This is also seen in the fashion, with Marv and a lot of other characters wearing tunics, while some guards wear Corinthian-style helmets, which gives Archenea this really unique aesthetic, which blends Greco-Roman aspects with the standard medieval design. Unfortunately, the remakes of the Kaga-era games did away with these design choices, taking away a lot of the Greco-Roman flair when they should have amplified these unique elements. For example, there are so many different types of ancient Greek helmet which could have been divvied up among the different countries, and the game could have combined medieval outfits with outfits from antiquity in different ways to create unique styles for each country. For having all these countries' different cultures would make the world of Archenea a more interesting place, and that is where I feel Archenea's world building missed the memo the most, as these countries tend to blend together when these nations should have been standing out. Conclusion: Archenea was the first continent ever made. In many ways, its age shows, as there are too many poorly defined countries that often blend together into generic grasslands with medieval-style monarchies. For each country should have its own unique aesthetic, and if the game was better at borrowing from the Greco-Roman parts of its medieval aesthetic, this could have happened and helped it differentiate from other fantasy games with medieval aesthetics. Fire Emblem 3 also undermines the development of the leaders of certain countries, and it was also a mistake for these countries to unite into one nation under Marv, as proper world building and story integration requires a good setup and payoff. All this means that Archenea's countries are amongst the weakest in the series. However, in other ways, the first continent still holds up quite well, especially in regard to its history, for there are so many stories that pepper Archenea's past, and most add to the richness of this world, whether that be the story of Goto and his two students, or the story of how Naga defeated the degenerate dragons, or how Artemis put her faith in Henri, who then slew the dragon Medius. I mean, even the weakest of these stories, which is the one where Audra stole the Fire Emblem, is interesting, but it is undermined by having easily the weakest payoff during the present day. For Archenea's other tales show how these stories inform the present rather well and partake in a satisfying bit of setup and payoff, which makes the history of Archenea overall delightful. This means that Archenea's legacy as Fire Emblem's first world is a bit of a mixed bag, with it having a lot of failures in terms of how its countries are handled and a lot of successes in terms of how its history is written. However, Archenea was the first Fire Emblem continent, and the fact that it managed to hold up quite well in certain regards is impressive, while its failures show how far Fire Emblem has come. I honestly do feel that Archenea is worthy of respect, as this is Fire Emblem's first continent, and despite its age showing quite a bit in some ways, I think its achievements are equally or even more so deserving of praise and admiration for what this more than 30-year-old foundation managed to achieve. Thank you everyone for watching. I worked very hard on this video, and I would appreciate it if you liked, commented, and or subscribed. I made another world building video that is just a general discussion, so you can watch that one too if you want to. And I am going to release a video where I rank every Chris support next week, so if you're interested in that, then tune in next Friday. Thank you. Goodbye.